In October 2023, Natalia Reyes, a 26-year-old nurse, moved to Valparaiso, Chile, hoping for a fresh start and newfound independence. Ever since she was a child, she had dreamed of helping others, and her work in medicine allowed her to fulfill that purpose every day. Strong-willed yet compassionate, Natalia had a reputation for her kindness and dedication, not just in her profession but also in the LGBTQ+ community. She attended rallies, wrote articles advocating for equal rights, and provided emotional support for those struggling to find acceptance. But despite the fulfillment she found in her work and activism, her personal life remained empty. Her honesty and openness intimidated many, and after several failed relationships, she decided to step away from romance. Yet, loneliness crept in. In a new city with few friends, the silence in her apartment after long shifts at the hospital felt unbearable. On October 18th, she finally signed up for a dating app. Her profile was simple, an inviting smile and a short bio expressing her desire for meaningful conversations. That same night, her profile caught the eye of Tomas Herrera, a 24-year-old mechanic. He wasn't particularly social, preferring the hum of an engine to the noise of a crowded bar. His friends called him reserved. He preferred to think of himself as selective with his words. Tomas wasn't looking for anything serious, just an occasional chat to break the monotony of his routine. But something about Natalia's profile pulled him in. Maybe it was her confidence or the warmth in her eyes. He sent her a message, and soon, their conversation began. From the start, their exchanges were effortless. Natalia was a natural conversationalist, unafraid to ask deep questions, while Tomas responded with quiet curiosity. He spoke of his childhood in a small town, his passion for fixing cars, and his dream of owning his own repair shop. In return, Natalia shared her experiences, her struggles, and her hopes. Over the next few days, trust began to form between them. On October 21st, Natalia suggested they meet in person. Tomas hesitated. He wasn't one for spontaneous decisions, and things were moving fast. But something about her certainty made him agree. Just a simple meeting, he told himself. They settled on her apartment. It would be quieter than a bustling cafe. That evening, as he got ready, Tomas found himself staring in the mirror longer than usual. It was just coffee, just a conversation. So why the unease twisting in his stomach? He shook off the nerves, grabbed his jacket, and drove to her place, unaware that this night would change his life forever. At 8:30 p.m., he arrived at her building. His hands gripped the steering wheel as thoughts tangled in his mind. He wasn't sure why he felt this strange tension, perhaps because he rarely met new people in unfamiliar settings. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out, walked up the steps, and rang the doorbell. Moments later, the door swung open, and there she was. Natalia greeted him with a warm smile and invited him inside. Her apartment was cozy, the air tinged with the soft scent of vanilla candles. A bottle of wine and 2 glasses rested on the table, and smooth jazz played faintly in the background. The atmosphere eased some of Tomas's nerves as he settled onto the couch while Natalia poured the wine. Their conversation began light, work, life in the city, but gradually turned more personal. Natalia spoke passionately about her activism, her commitment to standing up for those whose voices were silenced. But when she mentioned, in passing, that she was a transgender woman, something in Tomas shifted. He tried to stay composed. He had never considered himself judgmental, but something inside him twisted. His pulse quickened, his grip tightened around his glass. He took another sip of wine, his gaze fixed on her. Natalia noticed the change in his expression, the brief flicker of hesitation. She had seen it before. It was a look she had learned to brush off, though it never stopped stinging. She set her glass down gently, her posture subtly retreating. Tomas's mind swirled in turmoil, confusion settling in his chest. He didn't understand why this affected him so deeply. Perhaps because it challenged what he thought he knew about himself. Perhaps because he had never been in this situation before. A tense silence stretched between them. Natalia remained composed, but her instincts told her to be cautious. The energy in the room had shifted, an invisible wall rising between them. She took a small step back, watching him closely, waiting. Neither of them spoke, yet the weight of unspoken words filled the air. And in that moment, everything changed. A sudden knock at the door shattered the thick silence in the room. Tomas flinched, his grip tightening around the stem of his wine glass. Natalia, however, remained composed. With a polite smile, she walked over and opened the door, revealing an older woman from the apartment downstairs. "Do you have a little salt to spare?" the neighbor asked casually. "Of course," Natalia responded, retrieving a small container from her kitchen shelf. The woman thanked her and left, but the brief interruption had done little to dispel the growing tension in the room. If anything, it seemed to magnify it. Tomas sat rigid, his thoughts spiraling. His emotions swung between confusion, unease, and something deeper, something darker. He had walked into this evening expecting easy conversation, perhaps even a fleeting connection. Instead, he felt as though the ground beneath him had shifted. Natalia noticed it too. She watched him carefully, moving with deliberate calm. She had encountered this reaction before. The way someone's entire demeanor could change in an instant, how an easy conversation could suddenly feel like walking through a minefield. A choice hovered between them, unspoken yet heavy. The night could still end without incident, or it could take a turn neither of them could undo. Tomas swallowed hard, but the lump in his throat remained. His chest tightened as if he were trapped, though there were no walls around him. Only Natalia, standing a few feet away, her expression unreadable yet attentive. Her eyes searched his face, as though trying to understand the battle waging inside him. But even he wasn't sure what was happening. What had seemed normal just moments ago now felt foreign, unsettling. A quiet anger, cold and unfamiliar, stirred inside him. His hands turned numb. Natalia took a cautious step forward, her voice gentle. "Are you all right?" He didn't respond. His gaze locked onto her hand as she reached toward his shoulder, a simple gesture meant to reassure. But to him, it felt like something else entirely. A challenge, a deception, a betrayal. Without thinking, he shot up from his seat. The abruptness of his movement sent his glass tumbling from the table, shattering on the floor. Natalia stiffened but didn't move. Instead, she slowly lifted her hands, palms facing him, a silent signal that she meant no harm. Tomas's breath came in sharp, uneven bursts. He no longer saw her as she was, only what his mind projected. A trick, a lie, a threat. A voice in his head whispered that he had been played, that he was the fool in someone else's game, that he had no control. His fingers curled into fists. Natalia took another step back, her expression remaining calm, though tension flickered in her eyes. She knew this moment could spiral out of control. She had seen it before. Down the hall, the neighbor who had just borrowed salt hesitated near the door, drawn back by the sound of breaking glass. She strained to listen, sensing something was wrong, but uncertainty kept her from knocking. Inside the apartment, Natalia remained still, assessing the situation. She knew she had to keep things from escalating. Carefully, she raised her hands again, keeping her voice steady. "Tomas, look at me." His breath was ragged, but he forced air into his lungs. He had to think, but his mind refused to work. He had no plan. He glanced at his phone. The screen lit up, unread messages. He didn't check them. He silenced it and tossed it onto the passenger seat. He turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, too loud in the suffocating quiet. His eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. A reflection stared back at him, pale skin, dilated pupils, a man he didn't recognize. A stranger. His only thought was to get away. But every streetlight, every turn reminded him of the truth. He couldn't outrun himself. Blocks blurred past. Storefronts, stoplights, the occasional car. He barely saw any of it. His mind was locked in a loop, spiraling between panic and numbness. He turned onto a narrow street and killed the engine. Stillness. For the first time, he stopped moving, but his heart kept hammering against his ribs. He listened to the night, but all he heard was the echo of his own pulse. Then his eyes landed on something, a bus station, late-night routes, few passengers, a way out. He started the car again, gripping the wheel tighter. He didn't know where he would go, but he knew one thing. There was no turning back, The investigation begins. The moment Carla's body was found, the countdown started. The police arrived fast. Red and blue lights painted the walls of the apartment complex. Neighbors gathered in doorways, whispering, exchanging glances. Some said they'd heard noises. Others swore they saw a man running. No one knew for sure what had unfolded behind that door. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Officers swept the scene. An overturned table, shattered glass, signs of struggle. Every detail screamed confrontation. But what had started it? What had led to this moment? The answers were buried in the details, and they were already beginning to emerge. One officer spotted Carla's phone on the floor. The screen was cracked, but still functional. Recent messages. Missed calls. One name stood out. Javier Rojas. The first thread in the unraveling mystery. Surveillance footage confirmed it. A man leaving the building. His steps sharp. His movements frantic. His hands shaking. His face tight with panic. This wasn't just some passerby. This was someone running. Someone hiding something. Within minutes, officers pulled his records, address, workplace, phone number. But Javier was already gone. He hadn't returned home. He hadn't shown up for work. His phone was off. It was as if he had vanished. But no one disappears without a trace. Detectives worked fast, mapping possible escape routes, questioning anyone who might know where he had gone. But there was nothing, until a lead surfaced. A night bus driver reported a man matching Javier's description. Agitated, unsteady, asking too many questions. Which route went the farthest? Where were the final stops? But in the end, he never bought a ticket. The search intensified. Every passing minute widened the gap between Javier and the law. But the walls were closing in. It was only a matter of time before he ran out of places to hide. Javier stood frozen. His body wanted to move, but his mind hesitated. Then, without thinking, he turned and walked away. The police reacted instantly. They headed straight for the bus station, scanning the surveillance footage. And there he was, Javier, pacing the platform, his hand gripping his head as if trying to hold himself together. He sat on a bench, restless, then abruptly stood up. Without a second glance, he stepped into the shadows and vanished. But now they knew. He was close, somewhere nearby, maybe hiding, maybe waiting for the right moment to disappear again. Officers spread out. They combed the area, checking alleyways, abandoned buildings, questioning night workers. Someone had to have seen him. Then, a breakthrough. A phone was found discarded in a dark alley. It was Javier's. The battery was dead. The SIM card removed. But even without power, it could still give them something. Forensics got to work immediately. And then, another lead. A taxi driver reported picking up a man matching Javier's description. He had paid in cash, never looked back, his body tense, restless. He had asked to be taken to the city's outskirts, to the abandoned industrial district. The police moved fast. Sirens cut through the silence of the night. The hunt was closing in. They surrounded the area. The old warehouses stood like ghosts in the darkness, their shattered windows gaping like empty eyes. Officers spread out, sweeping every corridor, every doorway. Then, inside one of the back rooms, they found it. A jacket, a half-empty water bottle. Signs of life, of movement. He had been here. Minutes ago, he had been within reach. Almost caught. Almost. But he had slipped away. Again. Now, it wasn't just a chase. It was a race against time. How much longer could he keep running? How much farther could he go before his luck ran out? Because the police weren't stopping. The hunt had begun. And there was no turning back. Javier could hear them. The voices. The footsteps. The orders crackling through radios. They had found him. There was nowhere left to run. He pressed his back against the wall, heart hammering in his chest. His breathing was shallow, unsteady. His mind raced, searching for a way out. But the truth loomed over him like a shadow. This was it. Then, a crash. The door exploded open. Blinding light sliced through the darkness, searing into his eyes. He flinched, squeezing them shut. But it didn't matter. It was over. Stay where you are. The voice was sharp, commanding. Don't move. Hands up. Javier exhaled shakily. His body trembled as he lifted his hands. His muscles burned from exhaustion, from fear. Running wasn't an option anymore. There was no escape. Figures moved in, silhouettes against the light, their weapons drawn. Cold, unforgiving. One step forward. On your knees. Javier obeyed. Rough hands grabbed him, forced his arms back. Cold steel bit into his wrists. The handcuffs locked in place. He barely felt them. They hauled him up, dragged him forward. His legs felt like lead. His breath came in short, jagged gasps. His mind reeled. How had it come to this? Just days ago, he was an ordinary man, living his life, working, making plans. Now, he was a fugitive, a murderer. His life was over. Outside, the night was thick with sirens and flashing lights. The warehouse stood behind him, forgotten and empty. Ahead, a police car waited. They shoved him inside. The door slammed shut. Javier exhaled, looked at his hands. They were still shaking. Through the window, the city blurred past. Streets he would never walk again. Buildings he would never enter. The life he would never return to. Flashing lights painted jagged shadows across his face. He couldn't escape the truth. He couldn't undo what had been done. A voice crackled over the radio. Suspect in custody. Operation complete. Javier didn't listen. The world had gone silent. Inside him, only emptiness remained. The car kept moving. The city faded behind him. But he didn't look back. Because he knew. He was never going back. The trial. 3 months later. The courtroom was packed. Journalists filled the front rows. Cameras clicked, capturing every moment. Carla's family sat still, silent, their grief palpable. Her mother clutched a framed photo of her daughter. Her hands trembled, but she wouldn't let go, as if holding on to a piece of her. Javier sat at the defense table, hands clasped, eyes downcast. He didn't know what to hope for, because he already understood. There was no defense, no justification. No words could erase what had happened. His lawyer tried, talked about stress, a moment of madness. But the prosecutor was relentless, methodical. They picked apart every detail, every movement, every second. Witness testimonies, surveillance footage, crime scene photos. Piece by piece, the case built itself around him, trapping him. Every fact was a nail in the coffin. The judge sat still, listening, unmoved. But his eyes held no mercy. Witnesses took the stand. The neighbor spoke of strange noises, unease. The taxi driver described Javier's nerves, the way he fidgeted. The bus station worker recalled how he had paced the platform, head in his hands, unraveling. And then, the police. They played the footage, frame by frame. Javier, running. Javier, hiding. Javier, trying to disappear. Every moment laid bare. Undeniable. The prosecution left him no escape. Still, he listened, as if waiting for someone to say it wasn't him, as if hoping it was all a mistake. But reality was merciless. The trial dragged on for 3 weeks. Each day, an eternity. Each testimony, a weight he could never lift. And then, the verdict. The jury didn't deliberate long. Guilty. The judge's voice was steady. 40 years. No parole. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Someone exhaled in relief. Carla's mother broke down, silent sobs racking her body. She covered her face, grief consuming her. Someone clenched their fists. But no one objected. It was justice. It was inevitable. Javier remained still. He had known this was coming. Still, when the words left the judge's lips, something inside him cracked. His chest tightened. The air thickened. He stared ahead, unseeing. He thought back to how it started. The first meeting, the first conversation, the way she laughed, the way things had been normal, before it all changed, before he lost control, before the moment that destroyed everything. Could he have stopped? Could he have stepped back? It didn't matter anymore, because ahead of him was only one thing: a cell, bars, time measured in days, weeks, years. He remembered her face, her voice, her smile at the beginning, and the terror in her eyes at the end. He closed his own, but the memories stayed. They would never leave. They led him out of the courtroom, He didn't resist, didn't speak. He just walked. Behind him, life continued. Voices, footsteps, movement. But none of it was his anymore. The police car door slammed shut. Javier looked at his hands. The same hands that failed to stop. The hands that made him a monster. And he knew that's how the world would always see him. And he could never change that die in the end. There was no redemption, no second chances. Javier's fate had been sealed the moment he crossed the line. The moment he let anger, fear, or whatever excuse he might have clung to, take control. Now, all that remained was time. A lifetime behind bars, haunted by memories he could never escape. Justice had been served. The world would move on. Carla's family would grieve, heal, and try to rebuild. But for Javier, there was no rebuilding, no moving forward. Only the slow passage of days in a prison cell, surrounded by the weight of his own choices. And so, as the door to his past slammed shut, another opened. A future where freedom was nothing more than a distant memory.
Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more